Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley has a point of privilege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And isn't decorum a nice thing when it breaks out in here once in a while? I bring a question of privilege after some significant work and research with regards to the bill that we have before us in Parliament. And I bear your consideration. A letter will be forthcoming to your office to outline and explain the specific details, but we believe we do have a prima facie case of privilege, and we looked at this with very careful consideration. I want to say a quick thanks to my team for putting this together under difficult circumstances. There are many charges of contempt that go on within this place, and not all of those are privilege, but every finding of privilege is in fact a contempt. The definition of this is that the powers of Parliament to do its job, Mr. Speaker, to do three things in particular: to legislate, deliberate, and hold the government to account, are paramount to all of our work. We know through the very Constitution itself that the exclusive legislative authority of the Parliament of Canada extends to all matters coming within the classes of subjects next hereinafter enumerated, that is to say, 1A, the public debt and property; 2A, unemployment insurance; 8, the fixing and providing for the salaries and allowances of civil and other officers of the Government of Canada. This will be the focus of our point with you this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. We've confirmed also this all the way to the Supreme Court in Canada versus Vade 2005, that the supremacy of Parliament to do its job in this regard is paramount and cannot be confined nor restricted. O'Brien and Bosch on page 59 confirm this, and that this right, this privilege, can be broken either individually for members or collectively for us as a group. And we include very explicitly, Mr. Speaker, that the privileges of members of the governing side have also been infringed by the process that's been taken on through C-38. The privileges of members on page 61, the privileges of members to provide the absolute immunity they require to perform their parliamentary work while the collective or corporate rights of the House are the necessary means by which the House effectively discharges its functions. Now, we've built our case and are confident that you will find in this, and somewhat hopeful, that the breach of privilege conducted here is significant enough to warrant a decision from you hastily after other parties have had their opportunity to intervene. In one of the last rulings by your predecessor, Speaker Milliken, on April 27, 2010, in ruling on the question of privilege surrounding the provision of information to the Special Committee on the Canadian Mission in Afghanistan, Speaker Milliken said, "In the system of responsible government, the fundamental right of the House of Commons to hold the government to account for its actions is an indisputable privilege and, in fact, an obligation." And herein lies our privilege, Mr. Speaker. We've used every available tool to the opposition through questions on the order paper, requests through the Parliamentary Budget Officer, through questions through question period, at committee directly to the ministers pertaining to this issue, to understand directly and implicitly the impacts of the legislation that the government has been moving forward through its budgets, explicitly about what the cuts and implications will be for their budget measures, cuts to either services or to the number of employees that will be affected. Now, allow me to say this, Mr. Speaker, and this is extremely important for your ruling. There is no dispute from the government side that the numbers in fact exist. The government is well aware of what the impacts will be on Canadians, has in fact publicly declared that that information exists. We've heard, in fact, from the Treasury Board himself, that he said in an interview with a reporter on May 9th of this year that he would like to release more information but was, quote-unquote, held hostage to parliamentary reporting procedures and labour contracts which require notices to affect an employee is going out before cuts to come. Essentially, Mr. Speaker, the government is requiring members of Parliament vote blind on the legislation coming forward. In our conversations with the Parliamentary Budget Officer and in his conversations with the government, he has explicitly requested the information that has been made available to him by right under the act that the government moved as its second act, the Federal Accountability Act, which at various places in the Act require the government to produce in a timely and transparent manner information that exists. Now, there's two reasons why the government may withhold this information. If the information is not accessible through access to information, or if the information is confidentially provided to Cabinet. Now, the Clerk of the Privy Council has provided neither of those reasons, Mr. Speaker, and herein lies the case of privilege. That in citing the reasons of confidentiality, because of some obligations under the collective agreement with the various unions that make up the civil service, while, as I may say as a caveat, is a unique moment where the government's actually cared about a collective agreement with anybody under their employ. The reason given by the Privy Council, the head of the civil service, is not a valid one, is not a reason that he can use to block information to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. That is not an exercisable reason under the Act, and in fact impedes parliamentarians from doing our work, and as I've said, vote blind on the actual budget itself. There is no cabinet confidentiality, and these are not pieces of information that have been denied through access to information. To say that this is critical to members of Parliament to understand before they vote on the budget is an understatement. The government has moved a number of measures. Within those measures are contained impacts on Canadian society, either through the services and programs they rely upon, and directly through federal employees who work for the federal government in communities right across this country. I would have expected members of the government to actually ask this question, but they have so far been mute on this point. In breaking the Accountability Act, the government has once again shown that perhaps the Act wasn't worth the paper it was written on, and this is the response that we got from the Clerk of the Privy Council in a letter written to the Parliamentary Budget Officer on May 15th of this year. But as indicated in the budget document, the government is equally committed to treating its employees fairly and respecting its contractual obligations. This means that departments will provide information to affected employees and their unions in the first instance as required under the applicable collective agreements. Once this has happened, then they will offer up the Parliamentary Budget Officer and through him parliamentarians the information. Well, the unions have been contacted and have publicly said to this government and to the Privy Council that does not break their collective agreement, thereby taking away the one sole reason that the government had to deny MPs their privilege. So allow me to run the timeline, and I'll finish with this, Mr. Speaker. The first thing members of Parliament sought to do was to request the information from the government, as is our obligation under the standing orders, is our obligation as members of Parliament, to find out what the impacts of their bill would be. This would apply to any bill. Certainly as bill is broad sweeping of this would be important. The government denied, either through question period or at committee. We then sought information through the questions on the order paper. That, too, was denied. We then sought information through the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who is legally obligated and enshrined with the right to seek this information unless legally denied, which he was not. That, too, was denied from government. We are now at a place where we are being forced in some short time to vote on a bill whose impacts the government understands, but refuses to share with members of Parliament and those people that we seek to represent. This is, by all definitions that we can find, an infringement on the rights and privileges of members of Parliament. If the House cannot hold the government of the day to account, then why have the House at all? If members of Parliament can't do their jobs, can't go back to their constituents with a clear conscience and understanding of the legislation that's been brought before us and its implications, then why are members of Parliament being in the service of Canadians at all? They're not. We seek this through you, Mr. Speaker. We carefully went through all the Ryan Robosk, which offered us numerous points. And allow me one from on page 281 of Burnham's Parliamentary Procedure and Practice, that the right of Parliament to obtain every possible information on public questions is undoubted, and the circumstances must be exceptional, and the reasons very cogent when it cannot at once be laid before the Houses. There is no such reason given by government. They do not deny that the information exists, that the cuts to services and programming for Canadians exist and is understood. They have said that from the very senior bureaucrat, the person who works with the Prime Minister. The Treasury Board President has also said that the information exists. Their reasons for denying members of Parliament their right to this information have also been shown to be not true. All that's left in defence of this place, in defence of members of Parliament, is you, Mr. Speaker, whose job and role it is to defend the institution, regardless of the twos and sways of the political discourse that goes on every day. The institution requires us to have the information, to both debate and vote with clear conscience and information. The government is denying that information. While this may be a pathology with this government, it does not give them the opportunity or the reason to deny members of Parliament this key and critical data. It is absolutely essential for us to maintain, as best as we may, through all of the discourse that goes on here, certain principles. And the principle that we in opposition hold dearly is that our job each and every day is to hold the government to account. There should be those joined on the other side who share that principle, because that is a principle that is shared by all of us. And they may heckle the opportunity to speak, Mr. Speaker. They may suggest that there isn't something of right and privilege here, but they know better. And I remember the days when honourable members on that side stood for these principles. I remember the days when we, in opposition, worked with this government on their second piece of legislation, the Accountability Act, of which we have quoted here today, that set up an institution which we agreed with, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, to seek and garner this information. And now what do we have? We have a government that insists that members of Parliament should vote blind, that Canadians should simply trust them, and that's somehow good enough. This isn't a right-left issue. This is right and wrong. The government knows it's wrong. The government has the information and is denying Parliament and parliamentarians and the people we represent access to information that we need. Mr. Speaker, there's much more we could say, but I understand the time is pressing. I'm therefore prepared to move an appropriate motion if you, Mr. Speaker, find a prima facie question of contempt. Thank you.